Now what we want to be able to do is use hotkeys to add tracks. Now we could do this a couple of different ways. We could simply go up to Project up at the top menu and add track, and then you have all of your choices listed right here. And inside there, if you ever forgot one of the key commands, you could actually see that I have them listed right here. So you have Control Command and then A. This is Control Command I, Control Command M. Now we've set this up on the PC to simply be Control Alt and then the letter A for audio, letter I for instrument, and letter M for MIDI. So let me go ahead and demonstrate how we can create an audio track by simply hitting Control Alt and then A, and it will give you a dialog box like this. Now, if you're going to be creating a stereo track for certain things like stereo instruments, like a keyboard from an external source or something like that, that is fine. But typically, by default, stereo will come up. So you need to select mono if you're going to be recording, say, a single guitar or a microphone or anything like that, even a bass guitar. Just remember, if it's only one person, it's a mono track. If it's a single guitar, it's a mono track. A lot of people make the mistake of creating stereo audio tracks and recording mono instruments on them, and then they end up having like one side panned all the way to the left, and it wastes plenty of tracks. This is a real problem in Pro Tools, specifically because they have a limited amount of voices. So if you had only 48 tracks that you could use, technically that's only 48 mono voices. So that means that you could, if you created half of that, 24 stereo tracks, that's all you would get. So Cubase, the Cubase 5, the full version of it, doesn't have that limitation like Pro Tools does, but I believe LE does. So you need to be aware of that. Anyway, so what we're going to do is just choose. We can, by clicking on these little buttons up or down, and we can choose like 4 mono audio tracks, or we could simply double click and then type in 6 or 4 or 64. So whatever amount you need, and then you can hit add track, and there is your audio tracks. Now if we wanted to create MIDI tracks, we can hit Control Alt and then M. And this will give us a similar box that basically looks, it doesn't have the stereo or mono because MIDI is just data, so it doesn't have anything to do with audio. So let's create 4 of those and hit add track. And let's create instrument tracks as well. So these tracks are actually going to have, instead of, we'll explain them a little bit later in another tutorial, but instrument tracks will have the instruments loaded on them already. So what we're going to do is hit Control Alt I, and we'll just create a couple of them. We're not going to select the instruments right now. And then what we're going to do is create a folder track. Now the folder tracks are going to be very, very useful because what we're going to do is we're going to show you how to pack all these different instrument tracks and MIDI tracks and audio tracks into different folders so you can stay organized, because you can see right now the session is getting pretty large. So what we can do to create a folder track is Control Alt and then F, and that will just pop in a folder track. It's going to depend on where you're going to leave it, but I'm going to put this all the way at the top, and I'm actually going to create another folder track and another folder track. And again, I just hit Control Alt and then F. Okay. Now what I'm going to do to create a effects channel track is to hit Control Alt and then X. And then this will give us another dialog box for whatever, if we want to select a reverb or an EQ or filter, something like a delay. So we can actually load in a stereo delay onto this, and then we can configure it later or right now. So we'll just go ahead and add track, and the plugin will pop up, whatever we decided to use. But for this example, we're just going to show you that on the bottom is where it actually went. So I just scrolled down to the bottom, and there's our effects channel track. And last but not least, we're going to create a group channel track by hitting Control Alt and then G. And this will give us also the ability to sum down several of the tracks inside the mix so we can have an easier mix. Think of it like this: if you had 120 faders across a live board, how in the world would you be able to mix that just by one person? You can actually run the whole board if you had, like, say, the drums had like 18 microphones on them, which is a huge amount. But if the drums did have 18 microphones, what you could do is you could bus all those things down to a single fader. So once you've got the levels for all 18 different microphones exactly where you want, you just route those to a single fader, and then you can move that fader up and down, and that will control the entire drum set. And that's essentially why you'd want a group channel track. Say you have an entire background vocal section where there's 19 vocalists and everything like that, and they're all on separate tracks, but basically you'd want to bust them down. Now, typically when you're getting group channel tracks, I do suggest using stereo tracks, because most of the time you're going to be panning things left and right. So we'll talk about this a little bit later and when we get into mixing, but for the most part, we'll just go ahead and create two group channel tracks. And if you don't see them right away, typically what happens is they get put down at the bottom of the mix because they're created inside of folders. Now what we're going to do is just show you very simply how you could add a track right here in the track display window just by right-clicking and then going to add track. And then you have several different things that you can put in, like a marker track or a ruler track, an arranger track, which we'll get into a little bit later. But all these things can just be added just by right-clicking on a track. Okay? If you right-click inside the window, you're going to see your tool palette, so that's why you want to right-click inside the track display. So if you notice if I right-click here, it's not going to give us that, so it's got to be here. So that is a simple way to be able to add tracks. Now what we're going to do is we're going to actually organize our session. One of the problems with this session is the fact that it's too big. I mean, we have to scroll up and down to find things. It's enormous. One of the ways that we can get around this is by zooming out so we can see more things. Now to zoom out, we can hold down the control key and then hit up. And as we do that, we can see everything on all the tracks. So we can have a much broader view of our entire session. Now everything does get smaller, but it's still easier to locate regions and what have you within all the tracks. If you can see everything, then you can move everything and manipulate it. So what we're going to do is if we do have like regions zoomed in too far, what we'd want to do is actually zoom out by holding the command or control key on the PC and hitting the left arrow. One by one, it just gets smaller and smaller. If you hold down control or command and hit the right arrow, you zoom in one by one. And that's a very, very useful tool. So basically now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and organize the session. And what we're going to do is on the folder tracks themselves, I'm going to double click on the track where it says folder, and I'm going to name this MIDI tracks. And then I'm going to name the next one audio tracks. And I'm going to simply hit tab to go to the very next one instead of having to hit enter and then double click on it again. It just saves one extra step. So this one we're going to call instrument tracks. So as it's displayed now, I have my MIDI tracks, my audio tracks, and my instrument tracks folder. Now how this works is we can simply select the first of the audio tracks and then just grab it and drag it in. You can see the arrow is pointing to that folder. And what you see now is kind of collapsed. It's not a full size. It's got a little bit of a gap here. And it still functions the same. There's nothing wrong with the track itself. But what it means is that you can actually pack that into a folder. And if anything that's in that folder and you mute the folder, it's going to mute whatever's in that folder, which is great. So it's kind of like a linking. The other thing it does is it collapses the view and makes the session a little bit smaller. Okay? So if you notice that these group channel tracks, when they were created, they actually were created inside of a folder that you can collapse and expand. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move the rest of the audio tracks into the folder for the audio tracks. And instead of selecting them one by one and dragging them, that takes forever, I'm actually going to select the first one that I need right here. And then I'm going to hold down Shift and click on the very last track, and it's going to highlight from the top to the bottom. Now I could have simply done this by holding down Control and then just selecting each one of them. That's specific, so I can like select this one and select this one and select this one without selecting any of the ones that I don't want. That's very useful by hitting Control and doing that, or Command on the Mac. But what we want to do is just simply hit the Shift key to grab these three, and then we're going to drag on one of them. We don't have to drag on a specific one, but you can drag the middle one if we want, and then just move it into the audio tracks folder. And I'm going to put this number 1 up on top, so it's kind of a 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I'm just going to close the audio tracks folder. Now they didn't disappear. Again, they just got packed away into a folder. It's very, very simple. And you can see if I mute them just on the one, I can mute them individually or multiple at the same time. But if I just mute the whole folder, it'll mute that as a link, which is a very nice feature. Same thing with solo. So if those were all acoustic guitars or something like that and we wanted to listen to just that section, that's all we need to do. So what we're going to do is collapse that. And then what we're going to do is the same thing. We're going to take all the MIDI tracks, hold down Shift, and then we're going to pack that into the MIDI folder, shut that folder, and then go into the instrument tracks and then pack them into the instrument track folder. So you can see now all those folders that originally that were there are now packed into folders, and I can actually zoom in. Again, that was Control and then the down arrow. So it's much easier to work with. So if I want to work on just my MIDI at the same time, so I can just see all these different pieces, there they are. If I want to shut that, work on my audio, I can do that. So this is a very simple way to stay very organized. And again, this is an instrument track, so I'm actually going to throw that in there. And you can see when something is actually packed into it, you can see that there is a region, and then you can just click on it, and it'll open up the editor just like if it was already open. It does the exact same thing. So it's a very, very useful tool. And again, you can mute those tracks, solo the tracks, and it affects all those.